"2019's surprise hot new trend in blockbuster filmmaking appears to be ideas that sound like, or were, parody sketches in trailer form, but they're trailers for actual, not a joke but the real thing movies. Starting with What If Dora the Explorer, but now it's Tomb Raider.
I have to keep going no matter what.
She's freaking awesome.
Of course, she knows this monkey.
And continuing with Joaquin Phoenix in Joker, a serious-minded prestige drama that reimagines a new origin story for a Batman villain apparently playing out in a grounded, realistic world without a Batman or any other superheroes, villains, or powers.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
And it looks fine? Kinda potentially good, I guess?
I used to think that my life was a tragedy.
I don't know, this is such a bizarre idea. You kind of expect it to be either incredible or a disaster, and instead this looks, like another dozen totally average movies about bitterly self-involved white guys going nuts and taking out their shit on a world that have descended in an unbroken line from Taxi Driver and the like since the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, I'm not saying it can't work as what it's trying to be, but apart from the clown makeup gimmick, you have to question what actually makes this a story that was demanding to be told again. The last half-century of filmmaking is positively drowning in characters like this. I'm almost given to question whether trying to divorce the Joker, or at least the Hannibal Lecter by way of Tom Ripley's psychopath mastermind version that's been popular from the 80s onward from the Batman mythology, is ultimately misguided in the same way that trying to do the realistic standalone Punisher movies was, i.e. the Punisher isn't really an original character very much outside of seeing a character like that interacting with superheroes. Now look, I get it, the king of comedy, but now even more like Taxi Driver and it's the Joker, is not an illogical place to go with it. Okay, since I know even in film school they only make you watch 3 Scorsese movies now, and none of them are this one, and it's never on TV anymore. The King of Comedy was a dark comedy, released in 1982. It stars Robert De Niro as a mentally unstable, struggling stand-up comic named Rupert Pupkin, who takes a late-night talk show host played by Jerry Lewis, who's actually really good in this, by the way, hostage in order to force him to let Rupert perform a televised set on his TV show. Though not a box office success in its day, it's come to be thought of as an underappreciated work in the filmography of all involved, and depending on who you ask, is often suggested to have inspired, in some way, both Alan Moore's hypothetical failed comedian Joker origin from the Killing Joke story and the Joker-centric Batman the Animated Series episode Make 'em Laugh, so yeah. With this, but it also feels like we're going to a place where we're either supposed to like Joker or even sympathize with him, or that whole circa 2008 edgelord meme bullshit about how when you grow up you realize the Joker is the one who makes more sense, which is just the most exhaustingly idiotic take from just the most tiresome kind of fanboy. Well, maybe second most tiresome after the ones who are still protesting the studio to blow millions to finish the even worse version of Justice League.
I am so tired.
Now look, I get how the Joker ended up gradually turning into one of these charismatic psychopath characters that Hollywood and popular fiction have both been way too in love with for the last 50 or 60 years or so. Even as the character originally was more just a gangster, professional criminal type with a strange facial deformity and a mystery as to where he came from and why he looked like that. He became the Batman villain pretty much because he was the original gimmick bad guy in Batman #1. The whole scary clown gimmick always kinda works historically, and they really did hold fast to the whole we're keeping the backstory a mystery business, apart from at one point revealing he'd previously been an unheard of villain called the Red Hood who fell in some acid, and that probably explained the clown face stuff, but nothing else before that. So he was enough of an open book to never really go out of style and fit pretty much wherever they wanted to put it. And then when it became trendy to turn as many top-tier recurring comic book villains as possible, from gangsters, bank robbers, and mad scientists who like to play dress-up, into just straight-up serial killers in the 80s who also like to play dress-up, Joker was one of the easiest of the big guns to make that happen with because, murder clown was a thing that had actually happened in real life a few times by then. And then Killing Joke happened, and that was pretty much the default Joker persona ever since, even though it doesn't really hold up all that well, and even Alan Moore considers it one of his lesser works, or at least the version that every other version seems to use as a jumping off point. But the funny thing about Killing Joke, whatever else you can say about it, is it's one of the only versions of this whole egomaniacal psychopath monologuing about his personal philosophy routine that really understands that type of person in an honest way, because despite so many fanboys only taking a surface level appreciation of how gritty and violent the story was, and what an edgy move it was to cripple and maybe not off-camera sexually assault Batgirl, and what a badass this made the Joker, and by extension Batman himself, for fighting him, the whole overriding point that Killing Joke not only keeps hammering at in the backstory, the origin, the content of Joker's speechifying, and even the whole denouement that it builds to, is that the Joker, like every other smarmy, disaffected nihilist who thinks they've cracked the code of life by virtue of detachment, is actually just kinda pathetic. If you only know it by reputation, the plot of The Killing Joke involved Joker abducting Commissioner Gordon and tormenting him with a slideshow of Joker and his henchmen shooting and mutilating his daughter Barbara, aka Batgirl. Intercut with this and Batman's attempt to rescue Gordon, we get flashbacks to what may be Joker's actual origin as a failed stand-up comic whose crummy, but not that unhappy life completely falls apart through a series of dumb random accidents, all on the same day that he's tricked into wearing the Red Hood costume by some crooks and falls into the acid because he's frightened by Batman, completing his descent into madness and turning him into the Joker. The hook, though, is that we're seeing this origin because Joker's torture of Gordon is meant to be a demonstration, proving what has apparently been the premise of Joker's whole otherwise random career of disconnected crimes, schemes, etc. over the years, that life and the world are random and cruel and pointless, and anyone, even a fine upstanding citizen like Gordon, is just one bad day with enough trauma in it away from snapping just like he did. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, why would Joker care about proving anyone could turn into Joker if he supposedly doesn't feel guilt about being the Joker? Well, pour yourself an extra drink, you just understood the point of this book better than most of the people who claim to love it. Because it didn't work. He's not broken, everyone isn't one step away from being the Joker, and he probably wasn't just a regular perfectly good guy with nothing wrong with him, even if he did get a raw deal that day. And as Batman points out, all the grandiose how I see the world bullshit the Joker has been lecturing about the whole time is actually really dumb, just a bunch of edgy, angry teenage crap that every smug crank with delusions of grandeur thinks they're the first person to figure out. He even starts in on World War II was caused by telegraph poles and German war debt, in case you were worried they'd be too subtle about this. But I mean, really, to miss this, you'd have to be one of those people who doesn't get that Fight Club isn't about emasculated, overcompensating white-collar dweebs secretly being charismatic, sexy, badass god kings, but rather about said badass god kings not existing and just being emasculated, overcompensating dweebs you should never listen to. And also, you know, the Project Mayhem guys were literally skinheads.
Like a monkey ready to be shot into space. Space monkey. Ready to sacrifice himself for the greater good.
And yeah, that tends to be the same dude who misses the point here, and even though more than a few of them are good, I really have a hard time, especially at this particular moment in time, not to put too fine a point on it, right? Getting all that excited for another movie where a weird loner rambles about how unfair the world is and how that renders whatever insane shit he's gonna do either reasonable or righteous or whatever. I'm not saying this is gonna be bad, I have no idea. We've seen one trailer, the cast is good, Phoenix is a hell of an actor, Todd Phillips is an interesting director. They got De Niro to come back and do a part in the movie as a shout out to King of Comedy. I like the reimagined Joker look, and good lord, anything is better than more Jared Leto. And it's unfair to hold internet weirdo fanboys who are stupidly obsessed with the Joker character for dumb reasons against a movie. It just feels like one of those instances where someone went to a studio with an interesting idea and got an okay, fine, but only if you deliver the least interesting version of it. But I guess we'll find out. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. God, okay, I have to talk about Joker a lot this week, don't I? I can't remember the last time I was this annoyed by the discourse over a movie I was this genuinely excited to see, which as of this writing hasn't happened yet, but will by the time many of you are eventually watching this. I gotta hand it to Warner Brothers. Whoever in their marketing and publicity department suggested they could not only overcome the typical rabid superhero fanboy tendency to aggressively resist film, that radically retcon character origins, disconnect properties from the rest of their franchise, dramatically change visual and design aesthetics, and more recently further break up the continuity flow of a cinematic universe can see, but in fact neutralize, harness, and convert that resistance into support by simply reviving the long-abandoned 1990s "this is the movie your mom doesn't want you to see" sales gimmick, deserves all the promotions because it clearly worked.
President of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the Hedgehog, oh, he really does my doilies. And about his attitude. Smarty pants. Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh!
Yes, like a 16-bit video game publisher with a mildly transgressive mascot platformer in need of differentiation, Warner Brothers and a gleefully complicit entertainment press have been able to transform What If Taxi Driver, but also things from Batman, I guess, from a marketing-savvy brand extension exercise, which may or may not also be an excellent film, and showcase for a career-redefining performance by Joaquin Phoenix. As many have said, again, I haven't seen it, those two aren't mutually exclusive, to a cause by leaning hard on a handful of critics questioning the potentially unfortunate timing of what looks to be yet another sympathetic narrative of a detached loner psychopath getting even with the world controlled movie being released in a moment when real-life instances thereof are increasingly and more directly connected to extreme political ideology, bigotry, and acts of mass violence, and at least seemingly a relative handful of isolated expressions of concerns from law enforcement about copycats of the Aurora shooting incident from years back, positing the modestly budgeted soft-launch pilot feature for the DC Black spin-off movie banner from the director of The Hangover and Road Trip as some kind of edgy art house pipe bomb, a dangerous and subversive movie that the man just doesn't want you to see because you don't want to hear all those truths it's going to be spitting, and whereby you are in fact taking part, in case the soaring, triumphant orchestral music hitting crescendo over those montage shots of people rioting in big groups and curtains parting, and the main character walking confidently framed by backlighting and give you a clue.
But now I realize.
Didn't clue you in a revolutionary action simply by supporting it, by going to see it, and buying tickets, preferably on opening weekend, either Friday or Saturday night when the hard count matters most, with your money, most of which goes to them, the movie studio, Warner Brothers, part of Warner Media LLC, a very, very large subsidiary of the staggeringly huge AT&T multimedia conglomerate. That's not to say that all big studio movies don't primarily have a profit motive, at least in the eyes of their studios for the most part, or that Joker wasn't produced with any higher artistic aspirations. That's clearly not the case. It's just also clear that apart from what seems to be a somewhat broad, we live in a society level of socio-political grandstanding in its narrative, those aspirations don't seem to primarily have been to become a metaphorical brick through the window of entertainment media wokeness or a rallying point for people fed up with whatever it is middle-class suburban youth without actual problems but who are angry anyway get fed up about these days. In fact, director Todd Phillips, in an interview with The Rap's Sharon Waxman, said that he didn't make the film to push buttons, instead describing his pitch to Phoenix as a way to sneak a real movie in the studio system under the guise of a comic book film, and let's make a real movie with a real budget and we'll call it effing Joker. Though Phillips has leaned into the apparent studio strategy of pushing buttons on the media by later blaming the film's pushback on the far left, whatever that means in an American context. So yeah, and also I kinda wonder who gets to tell James Mangold, Matthew Vaughn, Ryan Coogler, Taika Waititi, Robert Rodriguez, Patty Jenkins, Christopher Nolan, James Gunn, Shane Black, and Guillermo del Toro, among others, that they didn't make real movies, but that's for another time, I guess. Now, it's also not as though Joker is even the first recent comic book-inspired movie to bank on topicality for putting itself over the rim at the box office. Marvel Studios and Disney made a point of opening Black Panther during Black History Month and enthusiastically promoted and signal-boosted the phenomenons of families and friends and groups attending the film in both cosplay and heritage attire, global audiences doing the same, and schools and youth groups organizing charity screenings of the film, all of which, along with being a pretty damn good movie, helped turn the film into not only another billion-dollar Marvel smash, but a genuine cultural touchstone and the first superhero movie ever nominated for Picture. And Warner Brothers' own Wonder Woman, especially at its moment of original release, was very much positioned by many fans and media pundits as a chance to see a big-scale fantasy of female empowerment following the defeat and denial of what many had expected to be the first woman presidency of the United States, a meme that was so culturally pervasive at the time that it earned the film an episode-length scathing dressing down from the Chapo Trap House podcast.
It's bourgeois individualism, but everything it fit in extremely well with like empowerment style feminism, where it's just like the only reason you would ever fail at anything is because you don't know how awesome you are.
I mean, almost every line in this that's showcased to be one of those lines.
The script was written from basic bitch Instagram memes.
Charming. It's also not to say that there's no such thing as genuine outrage or offense when it comes to movies or any sort of media, or legitimate reason to stand up in passionate defense of the same. The fact that the movie studios and the marketing publicity divisions of corporate media are in the business of manipulating and exacerbating people's actual reactions or legitimate concerns in order to maximize their business one way or the other doesn't mean that there can't ever be a truly spontaneous reaction either way. Believe it or not, even the most dedicated and insidious propagandist in the modern era understands that they're running a flea circus, not a puppet show, meaning they're mostly waiting for the people to tell them what's going to make the people react or not. So before we all formulate our hot takes about the first comic book movie, serious, dark, psychological, complex drama for real, mature, grown-up big boys since the last several and until the next one, and especially before you throw an internet mantrum about someone else's take, maybe stop and ask yourself, am I really as upset as I think I am, or am I letting the constant static from one of the biggest producers of such on the planet prod me into doing their marketing for free? And if so, isn't the joke really on me? I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.
Well, alright. I was really hoping we were done with the whole grim and gritty realism thing, and yeah, the director is making an asshole of himself in the press and social media for no reason, which is never a great sign, but this is a pretty interesting idea for a spin-off movie. The trailers have been promising, Joaquin Phoenix looks interesting, and I can see how this would open up the genre to fun and alternative takes and a space for people to really stretch within the studio system. So yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I'm optimistic. Let's see what you got, Joker. Oh boy, this is not working. Oh no. Oh boy. Okay, well, but it is technically well made, I guess, and I really don't want the internet to be throwing things at me all fucking year, so okay, movie, I'm willing to be super generous and let you off with like a 5 out of 10 if you can just get to the end of yourself without having him deliver a big dramatic monologue about society and hypocrisy and all the stuff that the preceding film was supposed to convey but did not. Deal? And you did the thing. Okay. Alright, okay. I'll give you one more shot if you can just maintain the courage of your original convictions that this was a one-off, unconnected, unique little experiment by not throwing in a gratuitous extra beat, leaving the back door open to syncing this up with the next wave of regular Batman movies if the fanboys demand it. Well, shit. So Joker isn't good. I'm sorry. I mean, I really am sorry. I wanted this to be good, both because I sincerely want everything to be good, since the world is kind of miserable and worthless enough on its own the last few years, and it doesn't also need the entertainment to suck, but also I'm just already tired here on day one of the inevitable, well, you weren't 100% sold on the idea ahead of time and you said so, which means you were biased and paid off by Disney or whoever and just want every movie to be one of the Marvel things framing being applied to myself and every other critic that doesn't fall into line behind what I sincerely accept was a well-intentioned but admirably ambitious misfire already. Now, partly because, you know, the sheer volume of irony involved in being lectured on deciding ahead of time to dislike something by people who already knew they were going to like it is frankly exhausting to cope with, but also because for a change, and rather surprisingly, Joker turns out to be the sort of bad movie that's bad mostly because it's so empty, unoriginal, and boring, with so little to actually say after all the self-insistence that the prospect of being forced to find more things to say about it even a week or two from now sounds like torment. In what's sure to become an infamously condescending press quote, Phillips claimed that he wanted to use Joker as a way to sneak a real movie in the studio system in the guise of a comic book film, but what he's delivered is more like a feature-length equivalent to one of those pop culture mashup t-shirts that you see on sale at these sketchy mall kiosks, you know, where like at first glance it's the poster for Scarface, but then you look again and it's not Tony Montana, it's like Vegeta, and you go, oh hey, that's cute. But then if you ask whoever the artist was, like, so is the juxtaposition of like the tormented immigrant's journey corrupted by the twin demons of American racism and capitalism as embodied in the Scarface narrative with Vegeta's Saiyan Dark Prince to husband father redemption arc supposed to be like mirroring an ironic or contradictory symbolism? They're like, juxtapahoo? So it is with Phillips and Joker, or seemingly, wherein he smashes together the rough plot outlines of the most famous visual beats of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, and also Martin Scorsese's The King of Comedy, complete with Robert De Niro cameo, and plugs a revisionist origin story for an iconic comic book bad guy into the villain protagonist spot for the ultimate purpose of saying, hey, if Scorsese or somebody had done a Joker movie in 1982, that would have been pretty hardcore, right? And not much else. The saving grace, yes, is that Joaquin Phoenix is very, very good here. I'm not necessarily sure that it rates as one of his all-time great performances, especially recently, but he clearly came to play, and it's all the more impressive when you realize that there actually isn't that much on the page for him to work with. Joker is a series of scenes and ideas and mood moments borrowed from other movies, comic panels, and bits of media that are meant to remind us of what those were about and rekindle those feelings via transitive property, but it's not really about anything coherent in and of itself, so the fact that Phoenix makes Arthur Fleck feel like a consistent character is quite a feat, considering the film isn't giving him anything to work with beyond, okay, now here you're Travis Bickle. Now you're Dee Fens from Falling Down. Now you're Lester Burnham. Now you're the guy from Fight Club. Okay, now you're the other guy from Fight Club. Now at least 3 different Sam Rockwell movies. Now officially, Fleck is supposed to be a luckless rent-a-clown and wannabe stand-up comic suffering from an unnamed but seemingly inspired by pseudo-bulbar affect mental illness that causes him to break out laughing at inappropriate times, struggling through a miserable existence, caring for his sick mother, and daydreaming of appearing on a popular talk show hosted by De Niro's character in a crime-ridden 1980s Gotham City, where a crippling garbage strike has inspired tone-deaf billionaire Thomas Wayne to run for mayor on an only-I-can-fix-it because I'm rich platform. But when Arthur loses his cool and murders a trio of Wall Street types who were bullying him on the subway, it creates an urban legend of killer clown vigilantes stalking Gotham's wealthy 1% that spawns a clown-masked class-conscious protest movement that begins to engulf the entire city. At the same time, dark revelations about his own past, possibly involving Thomas Wayne himself, push Arthur over the edge and toward adopting the mantle of the Joker to continue adopting the mantle of the Joker, basically. It's not really a movie with much of an end game or a point, though it definitely thinks it has several points and proudly shows this off well before we get to the moment of the Joker literally and metatextually lecturing the audience about the true function of comedy and the fact that society, hey, we live in one of those, did you know? Being truly to blame for him being him, which frustratingly isn't even supported by the text of the plot. In fact, if Joker does have a coherent thematic or moral arc to call its own, it doesn't, but if it did, it would boil down to Fleck's journey of self-actualization through realizing that while society can be tough, the real cause of all of your problems is probably a woman. But because this is a movie that's only constructed to confer a sense of meaningfulness and depth on its subject by borrowing the sense memory of meaning and depth from other more familiar things, its narrative and thematic structure are all over the map. Fleck's personal journey and the Gotham class warfare uprising don't ultimately have anything to do with or say about each other. Splitting his authority figure fixations between De Niro's talk show guy and Thomas Wayne don't add up to anything other than fitting in more Batman stuff and leaves both subplots underdeveloped. Zazie Beetz gets utterly wasted on a character who makes no sense other than to set up a reveal that will be absolutely shocking to anyone in the audience who hasn't seen a movie before. And even its most sincere saving grace, apart from Phoenix's performance, the truly excellent 1980s Urban Decay production design ends up betraying the shallowness of its inception. Despite all the effort in recreating the late 70s, early 80s Scorsese New York aesthetic for Gotham, Joker's heavy-handed political allusions are all about Occupy, Anonymous, 99% classism angst, all pointed straight at 2019. And one of the major plot points involves one of Arthur's stand-up routines essentially going viral, which was in no way a thing 30 years ago. In other words, it has no meaningful or important connection to the era it's trying so hard to take place in, other than to remind you that you're supposed to be thinking about Taxi Driver. You know, guys, I wanted this to be good too, because if we're going to have so many of these, people need to be able to go outside the box and do different mold-breaking stuff. But this isn't it. Joker is a shallow movie playing at being deep, a basic movie that thinks it's complex, and not even a particularly shocking or violent or weird or transgressive enough one to be outraged about in any meaningful way. It has nothing much to say, and yet it won't shut up. 4 out of 10, mostly for Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah, guess I'll go move into the panic room.
So Joker made a bunch of money at the box office over the weekend, which is being treated as a surprise for purposes of further marketing, as though the idea that a movie about probably the second most popular character in one of the most popular franchises in the most popular movie genre on the planet for like the last decade of human history, pulling a big number opening uncontested in early fall, is some kind of miraculous, unexpected victory for the film and its fans against the overwhelming adversary of marginally divided reviews from professional critics and some scattering overhyping of random concern trolling in the national media.
I'm deflated. A fitting end for you, Joker.
Which you may recall turned bizarrely political when director Todd Phillips, previously best known for Road Trip, the Hangover trilogy, and the feature adaptation of Starsky and Hutch, stated that his making the film was inspired by traditional comedy having been killed by quote-unquote woke culture, and later pinned the negative reviews on the far left. So there's a certain irony in one of his film's most passionate defenders turning out to be left-wing activist and documentarian provocateur Michael Moore, of all people, who took to Instagram after a screening of the film at the New York Film Festival to declare that he had witnessed a cinematic masterpiece, and that contrary to the supposed societal dangers posed by the film, the greater danger to society may be if you don't go to see this movie, because the story it tells and the issues it raises are so profound, so necessary, that if you look away from the genius of this work of art, you will miss the gift of the mirror it is offering us. In a subsequent post, Moore would further elaborate. Joker makes it clear we don't really want to get to the bottom of this, or to try to understand why innocent people turn into jokers after they can no longer keep it together. No one wants to ask why 2 smart boys skipped their 4th-hour AP French philosophy class at Columbine High to slaughter 12 students and a teacher. No one would dare ask why the son... Yeah, Mike, I'm gonna cut you off right there, cause, yeah, we actually do know why the 2 kids at Columbine did it. Because they made videos and wrote it down in journals beforehand. But anyway, the fact that I was overwhelmingly certain that Joker was not, in fact, about the things Michael Moore was ascribing to it in any meaningful way, those of you who've seen my review of the film of course know that I was not a fan, for me only served to highlight one of its most curious qualities, that it's a film comprised almost entirely of surface-level texture, aesthetics, visual cues, needle-drop soundtrack, auditory mood notes, allusions to contemporary social topics and politics, but with all of them decoupled from any inherent meaning that they typically possess and none of it unified by any cohesive theme. In other words, a movie that in certain key points looks or feels like it has something to say or might even be about something, but in fact isn't really about anything, even though it seems to have wanted to be and occasionally sounds like it's saying something, but then isn't. To fully get at what I'm saying requires describing basically the plot of the film and its major events, so as quickly as possible. This version of the Joker starts out as a guy named Arthur Fleck, who is poor and miserable because he suffers from a neurological condition of initially unknown origin that causes him to suffer fits of uncontrolled laughing in inappropriate situations. He lives alone in an economically stagnant 1980s Gotham City with his ailing mother, works part-time as a clown, and dreams of becoming a stand-up comedian and performing on the locally recorded Murray Franklin late-night talk show. During a particularly bad series of events, Arthur shoots and kills 3 mean, drunken investment bankers from Wayne Enterprises Corporation who are bullying him on the subway, which seems to trigger the beginning of a psychotic break and gives him the confidence to pursue a romantic relationship with his pretty neighbor. Because Arthur was wearing his clown makeup at the time, it also creates an urban legend of an anti-greed killer clown vigilante hunting down Gotham's 1%, which inspires billionaire Thomas Wayne to run for mayor on a Law & Order platform, and in turn inspires an underclass revolution clown mask protest movement. Arthur subsequently learns that his mother used to work for Thomas Wayne, had an affair with him, and that Arthur is actually Wayne's illegitimate son. But when he confronts both Wayne and the actual records about this, it turns out that Arthur's mother was severely mentally ill, hallucinated her relationship, adopted Arthur to make her fantasy feel more real, and then neglected him, being violently abused by her real partners, causing the injuries that led to his neurological damage. He also realizes that he himself has been similarly hallucinating the romance with his neighbor, and learns that Murray Franklin has used a video clip of him bombing at an open mic comedy night as the subject of mockery on his show, causing him to snap, murder his mother, and finally adopt the identity of the Joker, agreeing to appear as a guest on the Franklin show with the aim of committing an on-air suicide. But he is instead riled up by the surprisingly positive reaction of the audience and an outside mob of clown-masked protesters to his off-the-cuff rant against the madness of society that he murders Murray instead. Finally, when a police cruiser taking him to jail is destroyed and Arthur himself is rescued and revived by the army of clowns now destroying the city, the Joker strikes a triumphant pose as not far away one of his self-declared minions stalks the Wayne family into an alley and shoots Thomas and Martha dead so that Bruce can begin his journey toward becoming Robert Pattinson like 2 years from now. The end.
Golly, thanks for taking me to the movies in this dangerous neighborhood, Dad.
Whoa, stop! You can't go down there! That is Crime Alley, you dum-dum!
So, as you might have now surmised, there are a lot of different angles from which to point out that this movie is extremely dumb in a way that makes the self-seriousness with which it takes itself particularly bad approach. The wrong notes played in the loudest key all the way through. You could literally start your what the hell went wrong with Joker doctoral analysis in 100 different ways and they'd all lead to the same breakdown, but since I don't have all day, I'll use the one that jumps out at me the most clearly. Why does this movie take place in the 1980s? And I don't just mean minor annoying stuff like there's no way Arthur Fleck is on 7 psychiatric medications in the mid-80s and not basically comatose all the time because prescription strength was a whole different context back then and they're imposing a 2019 opioid psych medication context on an 80s setting, or how a huge plot point turns on what's essentially a video clip going viral, which didn't just happen back then. I'm talking about the why of these issues. You see, setting a movie out of time, especially in the recent past, is a big undertaking. It's probably where most of this movie's $55 million budget went. You have to change the backgrounds, use different lighting, dress sets down to tiny details, get old cars, old clothes, old TV and video clips, match reference photos, digitally alter the skyline if it's a real location, all kinds of stuff. So there's usually a specific reason it has to be done, a point that the story is making, or a portion of the narrative that can only be conveyed in the sense of that temporal context, usually in a socio-political or historical reference point. But basically none of Joker's socio-political reference points have any connection to the historical context they're being juxtaposed with, and neither does that juxtaposition provide any meaningful counter-context. The anti-rich people clown mobs are a Joker-fied mashup of the Occupy Wall Street and Anonymous movements, both of which were phenomenons of the early 2000s. They don't make sense transposed into what we're, I guess, supposed to take as an otherwise similar recreation of a 1980s city environment, because urban mass violence flashpoints in the 80s were almost always about racial tension, to one degree or another, and there's no context given in the movie for anything happening that's making Gotham's situation any different. Speaking of which, the lone historical allusion in the film is about that very thing. Joker's first killing on the subway and elevation to folk hero status by the media is a clear evocation of the 1984 Bernie Getz shootings, wherein a white guy named That shot 4 black teenagers he claimed tried to rob him on a New York subway and eventually surrendered to police claiming self-defense, but was later revealed to have said a bunch of really suspicious racist stuff leading up to it, and also the kids were maybe just panhandling and the whole thing was a huge scandalous mess, but that happened after the media had already spent months writing about a heroic subway vigilante.
I don't like the twist this joke is taking.
And so Joker's seemingly edgy maneuver of evoking this famous event, cutting out its distinctly 80s race politics and substituting the visual language of 2019 class politics, allows it to say, it's the same way that Arthur's issues with cuts to his social services and medication have the look of an 80s healthcare system, but are presented in the manner that's all about 2019's various prescription, addiction, opioid crisis. Or the viral video thing, which is trying badly to plug a critique of present-day social media shaming of ordinary people into an incompatible era where the big concern about media privacy was paparazzi and celebrity tabloid obsession, using cheesy references to a movie from that era about that thing. A movie that was, of course, a thematic reunion feature for the director and star of another movie that Joker takes the bulk of its late 70s, early 80s reference cues from and very much wants you to be thinking of at all times, Taxi Driver, because that's a great film, perhaps the great film, about an alienated loner losing his grip on reality and turning to violent power fantasies in an unfeeling urban hellscape. It created the universally understood language of such films, and while Joker may be running on fumes, those fumes are an understanding that if it can recite the language phonetically, it doesn't need to understand or speak it. And that's what I mean by this movie not really being about anything, because it's all texture with nothing underneath it. Arthur's big speech sounds and directed and is staged like a big important scene where something meaningful gets said in a movie like this at this point.
See, this is the scene of the movie where you help me out.
But he doesn't really say anything. There are riots where the action and score tell us society has broken down, but we don't know what not broken meant in this world. It's grimy and edgy and poised on the edge of urban apocalypse like early 80s movies were, but without the authentic real world outside the theater context those movies were feeding off of. It's just an echo, a reference, the equivalent of an old-time video filter on a photo app. And what little semblance of a point it does offer to make contradicts what little text it actually has. Arthur all but bellows that society turned him into the Joker, but we and he just got done finding out that it was actually just his mother that was primarily responsible for like 90% of what happened to him, and he killed her for it. In fact, if you pull out the ultimately meaningless references to other movies and comic book Easter eggs, and ignore that filmmakers and Warner Brothers marketing have claimed the movie is about and just went by what's on screen, you might conclude that Joker is just a straightforward, if pointedly extra misogynist, serial killer drama about how the abused, infantilized Arthur belatedly achieves psychotic manhood as the confident, swaggering Joker by escaping and killing the controlling, abusive mother figure who'd infantilized him in the first place. Now, I don't know if that's the movie they intended to make, but that's the movie they kind of made. Whoa. Now, look, this is not like a take two of my Joker review where I basically said it was mediocre and too empty to be upset about or doubling down on anything else. I sincerely felt that the manner in which the film managed to be self-righteously bland was worthy of a more in-depth elaboration, and this was that. I also don't think it was a film made lazily or with cynical intent. It's very possible that all of these less-than-functional decisions that I've observed were made with high-minded intentions, and that Todd Phillips, etc., and the other filmmakers have very detailed, heartfelt explanations for each one. But the thing about explanations is, well, you want to take this one, Mr. J?
If you have to explain a joke, there is no joke!
I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. Someone save me from this maddening stretch of year covering entertainment industry happenings that can only infuriate me but also keep the lights on, or so I'm told. I don't actually work where the lighting bills get paid or do or not because the atomized nature of the modern digital workforce is such that, look, it's complicated. We live in a society, haven't you heard? Speaking of which, since this is the obligatory, hey, they announced the Oscar nominations and people are upset about things episode for the year, the big news, I guess, is that Todd Phillips' Joker is nominated for 11 prizes, which is exactly 10.5 more than it deserves, and I say that mainly because the score is actually pretty interesting, so okay, that's nifty. Otherwise, I feel like this is something I'm expected to have a hot take about because I really didn't like the movie very much, and the studio and filmmakers very successfully turned the release of this into one of those cultural event things where the existence of the thing is tied into some bigger socio-political discourse you have to have an opinion on, and it has to be engaged in some big wide-ranging argument, but really, honestly, I don't. It got nominated, whatever, I didn't care for it, some do, fine. But if we must talk about this, fine. The thing about this is, unlike some mainstream blockbuster event movies recently where it was implicitly the case that there was bigger stuff involved like Black Panther, or where it became the case like Wonder Woman or Captain Marvel, or whichever reboot of Ghostbusters we're on at this point, like I said in my original review and subsequent episodes on the subject, because hey, I gotta eat too, Joker wasn't really all that interesting to me, or about anything as far as I could tell, and there wasn't much discussion to be had. The closest you could get is to make note of how certain visual cues, musical musical motifs, gradations of cinematography, editing decisions, lighting choices, cultural and pop cultural references, and narrative perspectives can trigger or not trigger the correct parts of an audience subconscious that tells the conscious mind, take this seriously, this means something, versus the opposite, and well, there you go, we just did that, and shit, there's still a couple minutes to go for a full episode, so... Now, speaking only in my own opinion, since yes, I'm aware I'm slightly in the minority of folks who weren't really bowled over by this one, and again, I don't regard it as interesting or unique enough to be the worst or best of the year or any such thing. It's average, mediocre, whatever. Viewed apart from the storm of nonsense that's led up to it, Joker as an Oscar movie probably wouldn't be all that interesting as a phenomenon. Removed from the current context, it's one of the oldest and most overtold stories in the cycle of award season melodramas, and otherwise highly derivative, mediocre, sad man goes ballistic but it's not his fault because society movie, with pretensions of depth in which an over-their-head director piles on late 70s grime aesthetic and mimics their favorite shots from Scorsese and De Palma movies to prove they really do belong in the big leagues, elevated way above the attention level it would otherwise deserve by a big, show-off, improv-heavy, crazy-go-nuts lead performance from a genuinely good, undervalued actor who's been much better elsewhere, frankly, and about whom the Academy feels guilty because, looking back, they probably should have given them the award a couple times before and didn't, so now they're gonna get it for the one where the non-specific over-the-topness of the role just let them bug the fuck out and do all their acting moves all at once in one film, or as it's called in Oscar parlance, pulling a Pacino.
Hoo-ah. 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 Get your... Hoo-ah.
So yeah, look at me, I'm recognizable and disturbed in an entertaining way, give me an Oscar, is pretty familiar territory and would be wholly unremarkable if no less exhausting and irritating, but for its incidental connection to the weirdly cynical fake underdog hype machine around the movie, wherein a director who's made a bunch of hit comedies with huge stars and a hugely wealthy movie studio owned by one of the largest media conglomerates ever to exist in the history of humankind acted like a film spun off from one of their most popular entertainment brands starring the most popular villain character maybe ever, was somehow an underdog or oppressed or under attack project because it didn't receive universally positive acclaim from film critics right out of the gate, and a handful of other journalists and newspapers and whatnot had the temerity to report on its release that was being marketed as transgressive, shocking, irresponsible, and dangerous by asking, okay, is it those things? From where I sit, or if I had my honest way about it, that Joker is or isn't nominated in this or that category would be a very secondary discussion to more significant outrages, if anything about the Academy Awards could be called outrageous at this point. How was Adam Sandler not nominated for Best Actor for Uncut Gems? Or Lupita Nyong'o for Us, Jennifer Lopez in Hustlers, Eddie Murphy in Dolomite Is My Name, two of the year's huge comebacks? Did they miss the farewell? Apollo 11 isn't up for documentary. Why? If two actresses from Little Women are both nominated and so is the movie, how is Greta Gerwig not up for Best Director? Did the movie direct itself? Like, all of those seem to be more pressing to me. And yet, here we are, one day into Oscar campaigning, and the story of the season is apparently still going to be this unapologetically cynical but very successful sales pitch still working. Joker has the requisite pile of nominations that a genre movie that's still able to pierce the upper tier categories can rack up, but somehow the narrative is still that a film that, but for the thin veneer of make-believe 70s style gritty nihilism and ultimately empty gestures at mental health and class-conscious wokeness, wasn't really all that interesting, fighting for its place and trying to end the stigma against comic book movies at the Oscars. And which stigma is that? The one that was already broken last year when the much more ambitious Black Panther became the first nominee for Best Picture from the genre? Or the one from over a decade ago when Heath Ledger posthumously won for playing the same character? Sure, it's possible, though unlikely given the somewhat staggeringly high caliber of the other 8 films nominated, that it could become the first film to win in the genre, which would be a big deal, but are people rooting for the film at that point, or some trophy measuring contest between two companies that they aren't really benefiting from? And if so, why? How am I looking on time here? Oh, okay, yeah, so that's pretty much the best I can do turning Joker, fine, whatever, into an Oscars episode, folks. Hopefully nobody else says or does anything else dumb related to this movie and I can focus on more interesting things going forward. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. So, how are you spending the age of social distancing and, depending on where you live, self-quarantine? Have we all written the great American novel, caught up with every show we swore we were finally going to watch, and or shredded our physiques into that Marvel movie real-life super soldier serum shape? Or are we stuck pondering the existential dread that got us to this sad point? Well, even if you're not making what you feel would be the best of this unasked-for staycation, at least you can be glad if you're not the sad folk who've decided to spend it still being somehow angry at a Saturday Night Live sketch from almost 2 months ago. Specifically, this bit about the then-upcoming Academy Awards from comedian Melissa Villaseñor, in which she identified a common theme in several of the highest-profile nominees. Remember this?
Joaquin Phoenix, skinny, laughs a lot, but still
Gee, I wonder if that film's respective fan base is still having a tantrum about it months later. Now, honestly, I really don't think there's anything new or deeply interesting left to be said about Joker, at least not by me. I said my piece, a lot of people liked it, I didn't. I found it shallow, scattered, overly self-satisfied, and far too content to treat looking like other movies that had points for having a point of its own. But since fair is fair and one needs to at least try to engage with an argument sincerely, even if you strongly suspect that it's coming from a place of ignorance, bad faith, or both, before dismantling it for the entertainment of one's audience, if one separates as best one is able the wheat from the chaff of the various backlashes to this single joke topical skit, the prevailing sincere argument that emerges that it's unfair and dismissive to characterize Joker in this way because the film was not only, in its defender's opinion, not about white male rage.
I gotta say, I don't remember that song in Joker, and I watch that movie every day while I work out.
But in fact was about a host of other more positive things such as class struggle, wealth inequality, child abuse, mental illness, the breakdown of civility in the age of mass media, and most importantly of all, further leveraging the market value and media footprint of intellectual property related to DC Comics publishing subsidiary of the AT&T Time Warner Corporation. Furthermore, even if the film is narratively driven by the rage of a character who is white and male, why focus on that specific aspect when said rage isn't based in those aspects of his identity, but rather, well, a grab bag of topical buzzwords, convoluted Elseworlds red herring mystery about Thomas Wayne, and references to two different Martin Scorsese movies, basically, at least as far as the plot of the film is concerned. To which I would respond, well, partly it's because, thanks in no small part to some attention-seeking commentary from the film's director, Joker had already become something of a conversation piece on that front beforehand, and thus getting in on the other side of that nonsense was a surefire way for the sketch to go viral, which is what all Weekend Update segments are essentially aiming to do in this era of SNL. But also because the sketch wasn't, at least from where I was sitting, only or even primarily about Joker, or The Irishman, which was the other film that gets the full song bit before the wrap-up medley.
This movie has a lot to offer. Al Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa. Gangster life gets kinda messy. Robert De Niro and Lil Joe Pesci. It's 3 hours long, they're old and they're young, and it's white male rage, white male rage, white male rage. Irishman.
It was about the Oscars as a whole, and a general theme of what not only these nominated films, but also the nominated films in general, popular media beyond the nominees, and the cultural moment of 2019 that produced them all seem to have in common, at least from Villaseñor's perspective, and in what was likely presumed to be the prevailing perspective of the sketch's audience. Remember, Weekend Update has not been about general punchlines in the form of headlines, as it was in the Chevy Chase or Kevin Nealon days for about 2 decades now. It was SNL's answer to The Daily Show, meaning that its humor is targeted mainly at viewers in the show's broader Gen X and older millennial main audience that follow daily political news habitually, and what that audience was likely to already know about the impending Oscars was its controversy already erupting in the form of widespread condemnation of high-profile snubs of widely expected nominees like Eddie Murphy, Jennifer Lopez, Awkwafina, Greta Gerwig, Lupita Nyong'o, and others, along with many of their respective projects, leading many industry pundits to posit that this overriding, if not precisely total whiteness, maleness, and inarguable traditionalism of the selections might at least be in part the manifestation of a backlash by the older, less diverse establishment guard of the Academy voters against recent status quo shakeups within the business, like the successful push to diversify the Academy ranks themselves 2 years ago, changes to the nominating process which allowed a wider variety of films and genres to qualify for Best Picture, public activism for diversity in filmmaking journalism by celebrities like Ava DuVernay, Brie Larson, and Patricia Arquette, and of course the Me Too movement having brought down multiple once powerful figures like Harvey Weinstein and made other less than savory industry power players feel accountable for the first time ever. In other words, it's arguable that the context of the moment subtext to the sketch for the audience of the moment was that the reason these films and performances found favor with the Academy voters while other, perhaps less conventional choices were overlooked was that they were the most suited to being cathartic vessels for the white male rage of said traditional old-school Academy members.
Manson, Hitler, white male rage. World War I, 'cause of white male rage. Little Women, big performances, but Greta Gerwig some 'cause of white male rage.
Or, for those of you whose eyes have glazed over because this stopped being only about the goddamn clown movie for a minute, the complaint isn't that Joker is about an angry white guy, it's that Joker isn't very original.
Buzz and Woody at it again, it's white male rage, white male rage, white male rage.
That having been said, there is another more substantive, theoretically at least, criticism being raised here. Sort of. In some of the more lucid, less agenda-driven, contrarian commentary on the matter, or rather agenda-driven but maybe by an agenda more meaningful than leave my gritty clown movie alone, is the opinion that movies like Joker are expressing an anger and frustration that's rooted in a genuine, if crudely stated, reality of real-world problems. That this and other recent films about explosions of incoherently violent outrage by seemingly ordinary people against society and the system are artistic manifestations of real frustrations and real outrages by real people in the real world about their lives, jobs, futures, inequality, healthcare, debt, psychological well-being, loneliness, fear, all sorts of things, and that by overgeneralizing the categorization thereof as simply white male rage, which comes with the potential side effects of implying bigotry and or other ulterior motives on part of the aggrieved, can have unintended or even deliberately insidious consequence of diminishing valid concern by caricaturing the tone and presentation in which it's expressed, i.e. if white male rage is an easy three-word shorthand for the collective frustrations of a section of the impoverished working class and then subsequently becomes a punchline, then said section and their frustration can be brushed aside as unworthy of serious consideration, in this case by a rainbow coalition of quote-unquote Hollywood elites who may themselves be superficially diverse but theoretically unified by shared membership in the upper class. And that phenomenon, the coding of certain types of expression of anger, disagreement, objection, etc., endemic to a culture or class, as somehow innately malevolent or unserious, is a real, long-standing problem in the world for a lot of different types of people and has been for a long time. Black American slang terms being associated with street crime are branded profanity without cause, Irish and Italian American regional accents being culturally associated with organized crime in earlier generations, feminine anger overall being branded hysterical and broadly diminished, certain verbal signifiers common to those who learn English as a second language becoming stereotypical shorthand for lack of education. I hope none of this is new information to anyone, right? We all understand that this happens, and that it's wrong, yes? But the thing is, I'm not 100% sure that it happens here or elsewhere collectively in the same way to white men.
This is Lance, our intern. Lance is his undercover brother.
Shit. What can I tell you, man? Affirmative action.
What?
And I say that as a white man, a very, very white man, my ancestors were on the Mayflower white man, particularly not to the degree that constitutes a meaningful class-based discrimination, especially in cases concerning representation, such as the subject at hand, because, well, as is the point of the SNL sketch, white male rage as a form of expression is not just not discriminated against in our popular culture, it's celebrated, vindicated, lionized even. I'm a white dude and I'm mad about a thing is the tone, tenor, subject, theme, and aesthetic of hundreds of thousands of popular songs, entire genres of music in fact, countless beloved books, the entire spectrum of American electoral politics as of this recording, hell a bunch of episodes of this very show, and more classic films than anyone would know what to do with. In fact, while the idea of upscale corporate Hollywood tastemakers scheming to police discourse about economic hardship and social inequality is a valid thing to be vigilant about, I would offer on the other hand that it's equally valid to consider that sad sack lower class white guy lashes out at society and or the system being so reflexively associated with important meaningful narrative in our culture is the only reason that a film as shallow, unfocused, and lacking originality as Joker got to be as highly regarded as it was for anything outside of its lead performance. But then again, wherever anyone came down on this, what's perhaps most amusingly surreal about the entire quote-unquote controversy is that when it finally came time to hand out these most recent Oscars, it turned out that the 2019 movie that really seemed to bowl over the Academy was Parasite, a film that was in fact explicitly about the literal and figurative rage and resentment of the impoverished class against the bourgeoisie breaking through to the surface, but also featured a white male count of approximately 0 on either end of that rage because it's a movie from South Korea. Because sometimes, even in this hell world, good old chaos theory will in fact lean in all like, hey now, those are some nice binary narratives you got there. Sure would be a shame if some reality got in the way and f***ed it all up, huh? I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.